He hadn't shed a tear in over 10 years. Not when the doctors gave his wife 6 months to live. Not even when his only son slammed the door and disappeared into a cold November night. But today, inside a dusty garage in western Kentucky, he dropped his wrench and broke down. It all began with a knock. A little girl stood at the door, soaked to the bone, clutching a backpack nearly as big as she was. Her eyes locked onto his, like she already knew exactly who he was. "Don't scroll just yet. What she said next will stop you in your tracks. Stay with us because behind that knock lies a heartbreaking truth, and a second chance that just might mend a shattered family." Joe had spent the last 2 decades surrounded by silence and the scent of motor oil in a forgotten corner of western Kentucky. His small garage stood like a stubborn relic, its cracked windows and faded Joe's auto repair sign barely holding on. Just like the man who owned it. He was 64, wore the same flannel jacket every winter. His hands, calloused and grease-stained, hadn't held anything soft in years. After losing his wife to cancer, and later, his son to a bitter argument that ended in slammed doors and unforgiven words, Joe chose solitude. Coffee in a chipped mug. Old AM radio humming out classic blues. The rhythmic clang of a wrench. That was his world. He didn't expect anyone. He didn't want anyone. Until today. A knock, a voice, a little girl, and suddenly, the past he buried beneath broken engines came roaring back through the voice of a child. Who was she? Why did she know his name? And more importantly, why did her words feel like they were meant to fix more than just old machines? The rain had turned cold sharp enough to sting as it dripped from the metal awning outside Joe's garage. He was under the hood of a beat-up Chevy, cursing a stubborn bolt. When the knock came again, 3 taps, hesitant yet deliberate. He stood up, grumbling as he wiped his hands on an oily rag, and shuffled toward the front. Nobody knocked on his door anymore. Not neighbors, not friends, not even Kyle. But when he pulled open the creaky garage door, what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. She couldn't have been more than 7. Wet hair clung to her face. Her jacket looked like it belonged to someone else, too big, too thin, too worn. And in her small hands, she clutched a folded piece of paper. "Are you Joe?" she asked, voice shaking. Joe blinked, confused. "Yeah, I'm Joe. Who are you?" She hesitated. Then, like she had practiced this moment 100 times, she said, "My mom said, if something happened to her, I should come find you. She said you're the only one I can trust." He looked past her, half expecting someone else to appear. No one. "Who's your mom?" he asked, the words already tasting like ghosts. The girl unfolded this paper. It was a letter, creased, smudged, but unmistakable. At the bottom, in familiar handwriting, was a name he hadn't seen in decades. "Emily?" Time seemed to stop. The rain, the tools, the aching in his back, all faded. Emily. The girl he had once loved more than life itself. The girl who left without goodbye. Now, her daughter was standing on his doorstep. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the rag in his hand. He gripped the doorframe as a wave of memories came rushing in, 17 years old. A rust-colored sunset, promises made under a sycamore tree. And now, this little girl? "What happened to your mom?" he whispered. The girl looked down. "She died," she said quietly. 4 days ago. Joe's knees buckled slightly. He caught himself on the wall. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she added, almost apologetically. She said, "You'd help me." Joe didn't respond. Not right away. Because how do you answer the past when it arrives in the rain, wearing pigtails? The house hadn't changed much. Same creaky floorboards, same faded photograph of his wife on the mantel. But now, A pair of tiny sneakers sat beside his worn boots at the door. Her name was Sophie. She didn't ask for toys or cartoons. She asked where the broom was. She swept the kitchen, folded laundry that wasn't hers, drew little chalk rainbows on the garage floor next to oil stains. Joe hadn't seen color in that garage in years. At night, he made her toast and scrambled eggs, the only things he still knew how to cook. She didn't complain. She listened. When he finally spoke about Emily, Sophie's eyes lit up like he had said something sacred. "She always smiled when she said your name," Sophie whispered. That night, as he turned off the lights, Joe noticed her backpack on the couch. Something peeked from the side pocket, a folded envelope, worn and yellowed. He hesitated, but then curiosity overpowered guilt. The letter was dated 4 days before Emily's accident. "Joe, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means I finally found the courage to face the past I ran from. Her name is Sophie. She's bright, kind, and everything I wasn't brave enough to give you. I wanted to send you photos. I was afraid. Afraid you'd be angry. Afraid you'd hate me for walking away that summer. For not saying goodbye. But I never stopped loving you. Joe, not once. I told Sophie to find you because despite everything, I believe you're still the man I once knew. The man who fixed more than just broken engines. The man who fixed me." "Emily." Joe sat in silence, the letter in his lap, the weight of 30 years pressing down on his chest. Outside, the wind howled against the window panes like a ghost trying to get in. He didn't cry when his wife died. He didn't cry when Kyle left. But now, in a quiet living room with a sleeping child, in the next room, he wept, not from pain, but from the possibility that maybe life was offering him something he thought was long gone, a second chance. But just as he began to believe in hope again, a voice from his past was about to return, one he never thought he'd hear again. The next morning, Joe woke earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen, quietly watching Sophie hum as she poured cereal into 2 chipped bowls, one for her, one for him. It felt foreign, soft, familiar, dangerous. The garage smelled different too, less like rust, more like crayons and sugar. Sophie had stuck another rainbow drawing next to the fuse box. This one had 3 stick figures holding hands. One had a beard, one had a ponytail, one looked like him. Joe smiled. But that moment was shattered by the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. Through the dusty front window, Joe saw a pickup truck pulling up. His chest tightened. Then the door opened, and from that truck stepped someone he hadn't seen in 18 years. Kyle, his son, older, broader, a trace of their shared past in his jawline. But his eyes carried years of distance blame, loss, and unspoken words. Joe froze. Sophie noticed. "Who is that?" He didn't answer. His voice caught in his throat as Kyle walked up to the porch and paused at the door. A long silence. Then, a knock, just like Sophie's. Joe opened the door, not knowing what to expect, shouting, accusations, or silence. Instead, Kyle said, "Neighbor told me there was a little girl living here. Said her name's Sophie. Said she calls you family." His voice cracked. "Is it true?" Joe nodded, barely able to speak. "She's Emily's daughter." Kyle looked past his father, where Sophie stood clutching her drawing. He knelt down, gave a small smile. "You must be Sophie," he said. She nodded shyly. "Do you know how to fix bikes?" she asked, breaking the tension with the innocence only a child could manage. Kyle chuckled. "Just once. I used to." Joe stepped out. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he met his son's eyes. They were different now, not filled with resentment, but something else. Hurt, maybe, but also longing. Joe cleared his throat. "I could use some help in the garage. That old bike needs new tires." Kyle hesitated, then nodded. That afternoon, the three of them sat on the garage floor. Joe handed Sophie a wrench. Kyle steadied the tire. Laughter, soft at first, echoed between oil cans and toolboxes. For the first time in years, the garage didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like home. But healing takes more than one good afternoon, and a storm from the past was still brewing quiet, but inevitable. Because family isn't fixed overnight. Sometimes it takes something or someone falling apart to bring everyone back together. A week passed. The garage was no longer silent, where once there had been only the clanking of tools. Now there was music, an old radio playing blues interspersed with Sophie's soft humming. Joe and Kyle worked side by side. Awkward at first, like two men trying to speak a forgotten language, but every bolt tightened, every tire changed. Was a sentence one that said, "I'm here, I'm trying." Sophie became the center of it all. She'd hand Kyle the wrong wrench just to make him laugh. She'd sneak cookies into Joe's coat pocket. One afternoon, she dragged in a wooden plank she'd painted. 3 generations garage, for everything that needs fixing. Joe stared at it for a long time, his throat too tight for words. Kyle simply nodded. "We should hang it up." Customers started trickling in again, neighbors who hadn't stepped foot in the garage for years. They were curious, then surprised, then moved. Because what they saw wasn't just an old mechanic fixing engines. They saw a grandfather teaching his granddaughter how to check oil. They saw a father handing his son a wrench not out of duty, but trust. They saw healing. Sophie had questions, of course. "Why did you and Dad stop talking?" Joe would pause. Kyle too. Some questions didn't have simple answers. Only long silences, shared looks, and a silent agreement. We fix forward, not backward. They repainted the garage. Bright blue trim, new lights. Sophie even designed a logo, 3 stick figures holding a wrench together. She insisted it go on every invoice. But in the quiet of night, when the tools were silent and the work done, Joe often stood alone under the garage lights, looking at the sky. He thought of Emily, of everything they never got to say, of the letter that had led a child to his doorstep and changed everything. He whispered thanks to her, to fate, to whatever strange kindness had let him grow old, just long enough to start over. And just as the town began to embrace their story, something unexpected arrived in the mail, an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. Emily, holding a baby, Sophie. On the back, a single line. "Even when I ran, my heart stayed with you." Joe held it to his chest. This was the beginning of something more than repair. This was redemption. But no story ends perfectly. The past may be behind them, but it always leaves shadows. And one final test was still waiting for Joe, one that would ask him to risk everything all over again. The garage had become something Joe never expected, a place of laughter. Mornings began with pancakes, always slightly burnt, but full of joy. Sophie insisted on helping, even if she broke more eggs than she cracked. Kyle would drop by early, claiming he came for coffee, but staying long after the pot was empty. And Joe, he smiled now, not just out of politeness, but with the softness of a man rediscovering life. But healing isn't linear. One Sunday morning, a woman from social services arrived. She asked questions. Too many. About Sophie. About guardianship. About blood ties. Joe's hands trembled slightly. He wasn't her grandfather. Not legally, not by paper, just by heart. The woman smiled politely, but her words chilled the room. "We'll be reviewing Sophie's placement. Until then, no final decisions." Joe nodded, but inside, he felt the walls closing in. That night, he sat outside the garage, watching the lights flicker above the driveway. Sophie sat beside him, swinging her legs off the wooden porch. "Will I have to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe looked at her, then took a deep breath. "Not if I can help it." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he gathered every letter, every photograph, every story Emily had left behind. He called an old friend, an attorney from high school, who owed him a favor. The next morning, he handed Kyle a folder. "If anything happens to me, you fight for her." Kyle looked at his father, stunned. "I will," he said, "but you're not going anywhere." Joe smiled, tired but firm. "Then we fight together?" They spent the next week proving love wasn't about DNA. It was about showing up, day after day, even when it hurts. They built a case, not with money, but with memories. Neighbors wrote letters. Customers spoke up. Even the town pastor visited the garage, hugging Joe and saying, "Whatever you're building here, don't let them take it apart." On the day of the hearing, Joe wore a clean shirt and the same flannel jacket he'd worn when Emily left. Sophie held his hand the entire time. When the judge finally looked up and said, "This child clearly has a home," Joe exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for 30 years. "Afterward," Sophie asked, "does this mean I'm staying forever?" Joe knelt, eye to eye. "You were never going anywhere." That evening, they hung the sign Sophie painted. 3 Generations Garage. Joe stepped back, arms around both Sophie and Kyle. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fixing something broken. He was building something whole. But even in joy, there's one more truth Joe had to face, one final moment that would test everything he'd become. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the garage rooftop like powdered sugar. The air turned crisp, and the smell of wood smoke curled through the quiet Kentucky streets. Inside, the garage lights burned warm long past closing hours. Joe stood by the workbench, holding an old photo of Emily. Her eyes seemed to smile through the yellowed edges. Sophie had framed it, decorating the corners with tiny, colorful hearts. That night, he stayed behind after Kyle and Sophie had gone inside. The garage was quiet, but not empty, because he no longer feared silence. It was now filled with memory and meaning. He looked around at the walls, the tools, the drawings Sophie had taped up, the new 3 Generations Garage sign painted above the bay door. A place that once echoed with loneliness now throbbed with life. And then, from the back shelf, he pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the letter Emily wrote him, and beside it, something he hadn't touched in decades. An old cassette tape. Joe dusted off the player, pressed play. Emily's voice, young, nervous, full of hope, spilled into the room. "Joe, if you're listening, I hope we both found peace. And if you're with Sophie now, thank you. Thank you for doing what I was too afraid to ask." His eyes welled. Outside, the wind howled, but the garage stayed warm. At that moment, Sophie peeked in pajamas on, hair messy, a mug of cocoa in her hands. "You coming in?" she asked. Joe wiped his eyes quickly, nodded. But before he turned off the lights, he looked back once more. It wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a memory made solid, a story rewritten, a family reborn. He shut the door, and for the first time in years, didn't feel like he was closing something. He felt like he was beginning. The garage never turned off its light after that. Not because business was booming, but because somewhere out there, someone might still need fixing. And now, Joe finally understood. You don't need to be perfect to be family. You just have to show up. Sometimes, the people we were meant to love the most don't enter through the front door. Sometimes they knock, in the rain, and all they need is for us to answer willing to forgive, to rebuild, to begin again, because healing rarely comes loud. It often arrives in whispers. If there's someone you haven't called in years, do it. If there's love you buried beneath pride or regret, unearth it. We don't always get second chances, but when we do, they often look like someone who simply needs a place to belong. Be that place. Have you ever been given a second chance? Or maybe you were the one brave enough to offer it. Share your story in the comments. Your words might be the hope someone else is waiting to read. We're listening, and we care.